My name is Stav Ronan. This movie is the story of my grandmother, Ayala Aviel. Grandma is a Holocaust survivor. She and her sister are the only ones remaining of her family. She married my grandfather, Avraham Aviel, who is also a Holocaust survivor, the only survivor of his family. My grandfather wrote his story as well as hers and published 2 books which included both of their stories. This way, their story will exist for many years to come and will teach the next generations of the era in which they lived. If I were to divide my grandmother's life into 3 parts, then I would divide it into life before the war, life during the war, and life after the war. Chapter 1: Life Before the War. Grandma was born on the 30th of March 1930 in the city of Rovno in what was then Poland. She was born as Hinda Liberman, and only later on in her life she changed her name to Ayala, a Hebrew name. She had a sister older than her by 2 years named Adina, who also only got her name later on in life and was originally named Adela. Her father, Meir Lieberman, was a pharmacist who owned a wholesale medication warehouse and a pharmacy in which he worked at. Her mother, Tzipora Lieberman, had no academic degree, although she did study pharmacy in the University of Kiev where she met Meir. She never finished her studies. Owning a pharmacy and warehouse made them a lot of money, which made them a rich Jewish family. Her father worked all day but still had time to be with him in the evenings. With him lived her grandfather and her divorced aunt. They were both unemployed. Her father was the only provider of their family, but as I said, he earned very well. They lived a great life and certainly didn't have anything missing. Grandma went to a Jewish school named Gimnasia Talmud, where she learned and studied in Hebrew. At home she spoke Polish with her parents and Yiddish with her grandfather. Grandma had and still has a great talent for languages, and today knows 8 in total: Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, Ukrainian, German, English, and Spanish. This talent helped her in her life and saved her in the Holocaust. Grandma also danced ballet and played the piano. Having great wealth allowed them to hire a maid who did all of the house chores. This let her mother have lots of free time, which she used to volunteer in WITSU, Women's International Zionist Organization. She was the vice president of the organization in Rovno. Her family was Zionist and wanted to immigrate to Israel, but knew that leaving Rovno would mean losing most of their wealth and income, making it impossible to live the life they were used to. Grandma's grandfather was also unable to make the trip because he was old, so they wanted to stay and take care of him. They were a happy Zionist Jewish family living in Poland who dreamt of coming one day to the land of Israel and building a country there. That was life before the war. Chapter 2: Life During the War. Grandma was 9 years old when World War II broke out. Within the Pact of Ribbentrop-Molotov, eastern Poland was invaded and conquered by the Red Army. Because Grandma's family was considered rich, they were hated by the Russian communists and had to pay a large bribe in order to not get sent to Siberia. Instead, they were sent to a small town near Rovno named Zulbunov. From there on, their situation went downhill. They lived in a small house that was very uncomfortable. They lived badly and didn't have enough money to live because their father's pharmacy and warehouse were taken from him. He was only allowed to go work as a pharmacist in a Russian hospital, but the amount of money he made there barely provided for them. They had to sell an expensive belonging of theirs every month in order to survive. Grandma stopped going to Gimnasia Talmud and started going to a Russian school with Russian and Ukrainian students. She had to learn both Russian and Ukrainian in order to study in school. She was only 10 years old and already knew 5 languages. They somehow managed to live on and hope for the end of the war. No one imagined that there would be a Jewish massacre in Europe. This situation continued until the 22nd of June 1941, when the Germans broke the pact and invaded Russian-occupied Poland. When this happened, the Germans put fences around Stulbunov and made it a ghetto. Meanwhile, Grandma's grandfather and aunt were sent to a Rovno ghetto, where they sadly died of starvation. Their situation was even worse, and her father wasn't allowed to even work. In 1942, her father gave a lot of the remaining money to someone so that they could sneak out of the ghetto and pass through a few countries in Europe until they reached Israel. They planned to escape on the night between the October 12th and October 13th, but on that same night, the Germans decided to have an action in the ghetto. Grandma was put to bed early that evening and was woken up by her mother in the middle of the night. Her mother told her to jump out the window with Adina. She said, "I am protecting you, Hindushu. Keep on running until you get to the next village. There you shall wait for us. Father is just taking money from the safe. We will come right after you." Grandma agreed to do as she said because she was sure that her parents were going to follow them. She jumped out and looked back, not knowing that that would be the last time she saw her mother. She and Adina luckily managed to escape the ghetto, and when they looked back, they saw the entire ghetto on fire, with smoke rising to the sky red as blood. They got to a small thicket and were there until the morning. In the morning, a woman found them and gave them non-Jewish villager clothes so that they wouldn't be suspected. She told them to go from village to village disguised as Ukrainian girls and ask for work harvesting beets. They didn't have a Jewish look, and their Ukrainian sounded like their mother tongue, so they didn't have a problem doing what she told them. After a few days, they decided to go to their father's old friend from university, Ksenia Alexandrova, who lived in Ovno. She wasn't Jewish, and her parents told them that if anything happened, they should go to her. They managed to find her, and they stayed in the attic of her building for a week. After a week, she told them that they could not stay any longer because her son worked for the Gestapo, and it was inevitable that he would discover them if they stayed. Ksenia told them that Germany was recruiting teenagers from around Europe to come and work in Germany. She told them of her plan of them to go to the police and say that they are Polish girls who were on a train to Germany that stopped in Ovno, and they went off to drink, but while they drank, the train continued without their belongings and IDs. Then, if the police believed them, they would let them go to Germany and work there. It was a crazy plan because going into Germany was like going into the lion's den, but Grandma and Adina agreed to it because if it worked, they would be set until the end of the war and wouldn't have to hide. They gave themselves Polish names and went to the police. The police believed them, so they got on a train to Germany. They didn't have any food, so they only drank water and they were always hungry. There were other teenagers on the train, so in order to not look suspicious, they crossed themselves like the others, but without knowing the difference, they crossed differently each time. From the left like Catholics, and from the right like Eastern Orthodoxy. This gave them away, and the teens on the train told the guard about them. They got off at the next stop and were taken to a Russian prisoner camp. There, they were immediately separated and questioned numerous times about them being Jewish. Grandma thought she was going to die and told herself that she might as well stick with a plan and say that she isn't Jewish. They didn't have any food or water for a day, and finally after a second questioning, they were released by a mysterious Polish man who might have been sent by the Poles to free them, or he might have just been the person who was commanded to free them because they weren't found to be Jews. He told them that they were in Majdanek. They didn't know what that place was at the time. They told the man their fake story, got on the train, and after a few days got to Germany. They got to a farmer who didn't want them because they were so weak due to malnourishment. Grandma looked like she was 10, and she only weighed 25 kilograms. After the farm, they got to a town not far from Leipzig named Tolgau, where they worked in separate hotels. Grandma managed to move and go work in Adina's hotel, and that is where they stayed until the end of the war as they planned. They worked very hard for about 15.5 hours a day and lived in a small room together. Even though they knew a bit of German from knowing Yiddish, they did not speak it because they didn't want to have a Yiddish dialect. They used hand signals, and only after knowing German perfect by listening to the language, they started speaking it, though they never learned reading or writing it. By then, Grandma and Adina had already known 6 languages. The situation in the hotel was bearable and actually quite fine, except when there were other Polish and Ukrainian workers who suspected them and tried to reveal their true identity. In those periods of time, they were in constant stress. As the war continued, they heard more of German losses, such as the Battle of Stalingrad. When it was obvious that Nazi Germany was going to lose the war, all the workers and people in the hotel left west so that they could be captured by the Americans who were considered merciful compared to the Russians. Grandma and Adina stayed because they still had hope that their parents somehow survived, so they wanted to be as Eastern as possible so that they could go look for them when the war ended. They had a place to sleep in and food, so it was convenient staying. Adina had bought a book that taught English because they knew that being able to communicate with the American soldiers who came would be valuable. That was the 7th language they learned. They stayed at the hotel and waited for the war to finally end. Chapter 3: Life After the War. The day finally came, and they were freed by the Russians. When the American soldiers got there, they were the ones who translated the 2 languages, which is quite amazing considering they were just teens. They didn't tell anyone that they were Jewish, because they thought that they were the only Jews left in the world, or at least from Poland, and that they would be killed if they were discovered. Until one day, in one of the celebrations of Hitler's defeat, they heard Yiddish in the crowd and found other Jewish survivors. From talking to them, they got to a sanctuary for Jews. That is where they got their new names. The man in charge of the sanctuary didn't let them go look for their parents because a Polish organization named ACA was looking for remaining Jews and killing them in Poland. From the sanctuary, they got to an orphanage in Salvino, Italy, and to a group that planned to illegally immigrate into Israel in a Mapilim ship. In that group was my grandfather. At the time, they hardly talked. One day, they got on a ship named Katrel Yafe and started their journey to Israel. There were sick people on the ship, and Grandma, Grandpa, and Adina were the ones who took care of them. About 2 kilometers from Haifa, they were stopped by a British ship, and after trying to destroy it unsuccessfully using explosives Grandma hid in her shoes, they were sent to Cyprus to a detention camp. In Cyprus, my grandfather wanted to study Bible, and even though he thought she would decline his offer, he asked Grandma if she would study with him. She agreed. They would sit every day on a white rock on the seashore, read a chapter in the Bible, discuss it, and then talk about other subjects such as their life before and during the war. That is where my grandfather first heard of my grandmother's story and was amazed of how such a small and fragile girl managed to do the amazing and brave things she had done. In late 1946 and in the beginning of 1947, they were permitted to come to Israel, which was then British-occupied Palestine. My grandfather went to a kibbutz to help build it, and Grandma went to study being a nurse until she became one and worked as one in Hadassah Hospital in Tel Aviv, which doesn't exist anymore, and then saw Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv till the end of her career. She and Adina never found their parents or heard any news of them. To the best of their knowledge, they died that same night during the action. In early 1948, Grandpa was recruited to the 6th Battalion of the Palmach. He fought during the War of Independence on the road to Jerusalem. Later on, he worked in several bookstores until he decided to open a business for distribution of books in Tel Aviv named Betalim, which he owns and works at to this day at the age of 85. When they weren't together in Israel, my grandparents sent letters to each other, and as their love grew for each other, they wanted to meet more. One time, Grandma walked 8 hours straight in the desert just to go meet him because she loved him so much. They were in love and decided to marry in 1952 in Tel Aviv. He was Avram Lipkonsky and she was Ayala Lieberman. They combined the letters of their names in Hebrew, Avram and Ayala, and came up with the name Aviel, which also happens to be a biblical name. They did this so that they could have a family name in Hebrew. They had 3 children: Tzipora, nicknamed Tzipi, named after Grandma's mother; David, nicknamed Dudi, named after Grandpa's father; and Sarit, my mother, named after Sarah, Grandpa's mother. One of Adina's sons is named Mayo, in memory of her father. This way, all the names of both their parents are commemorated. They now have 10 grandchildren: Aya, Ron, Yoni, Noam, Matan, Neta, Rotem, my sister, Dolev, my brother, and Stav, myself. Aya and Ron are both married, and Ron has a 3-month-old son named Eitan, making Grandma and Grandpa great-grandparents. Their greatest achievement in their eyes and their greatest victory over the Nazis is that they built a great family in the Jewish state of Israel. Now that we have a country, a Holocaust shall never happen again. Let this movie tell us the story of Ayala, my grandmother. Let us remember Ayala's family that perished in the terrible Holocaust of the Jews. Let us know the story of Jews in Europe prior to the Holocaust and during it. And let us remember and never forget the 6 million victims of it. Thank you for watching. The end.